For the skeptic, unable or unwilling to work out the logic that every creation has a creator, let us consider the following. The house you live in had neither an architect nor a carpenter. The car you drive had no designer nor engineer. No one working on the assembly line to fabricate and fit parts together, to tighten nuts on bolts, or fasten a fender to a frame with metal screws. The food you eat comes from no cultivated field, whose seeds bear the fruits of the farmer's plowing and planting and harvesting. The laptop you use had no designer and no engineer, nor did the software operating in it have anyone to code it to construct the hardware what to do. The steel that frames the world's skyscrapers had no one to mine the coal, to smelt the iron ore, to forge the steel girders that grew like skeletal bones to form the infrastructure for the housing and movement of all the world's commerce. None of these designs in the minds of man, nor the laborer that brought the designs into being, even exist. These claims follow the lines of reasoning analogous to logic often used to deny that the universe has a beginning, and that the great designer of all things seen and unseen brought all material substance into existence. The raw materials that men handle, manipulate, financialize, commodify, marketize, trade, buy, sell, covet, and steal. If man is the highest tool-making creature, man, it's worth noting, needed millennia to build the tools and technologies needed to examine the heights, the depths, and the lengths of God's eternal creative mind, and his omnipresence and power that sustain it all. The best telescopes are still attempting to reach the limits of the visible universe. The best microscopes are still attempting to plumb the depths of the mysteries of material matter. After millennia of making calculating machines beyond his 10 fingers, man finally produced supercomputers, sufficiently capable of decoding the code of human life and making some meaning of an alphabet billions of characters long. These amazing abilities to conceive of and give birth to many kinds of creations that fill the imaginations of countless human beings, blessed with opposable thumbs, are the indirect reflection of God, who made man in his image, male and female made he them. These facts, however, have not prevented scheming men in positions of earthly power to try to dispossess others of living out their God-given call. And just what might that be? Genesis records that on the sixth day, God said, quote, "Let us make man in our image and likeness, to rule the fish in the sea, the birds of heaven, the cattle, all wild animals on earth, and all reptiles that crawl upon the earth." Unquote. In the end times, however, we find many will depart from the faith, even faith in themselves to live out their God-given birthright to rule, give attention to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, forbidding people to marry and order them to abstain from certain foods, which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. Has anyone noticed how the treasures of earth have been slowly annexed, fenced in, carried off, refined, reprocessed, adulterated, and nowadays financialized as instruments of trade and investment in the interest of enlarging the stock portfolios of those vested in the new global carbon markets? Is it by sheer coincidence that a handful of transnational financial corporate powers have managed to monopolize control over the world's material wealth, and that the treasures made by the eternal Word are coming into the hands of fewer and fewer elites? Has anyone not noticed the technocrats demanding we abstain from certain foods, concocting manufactured market demands for their laboratory-made meats and alternative proteins?
But people are not willing to give up meat. So possibly we can use human engineering to make it the case that we're intolerant to certain kinds of meat, to certain kinds of bovine proteins. And there's actually analogs of this in life. There's this thing called the Lone Star tick, where if it bites you, you will become allergic to meat. I can sort of describe the mechanism. So that's something that we can do through human engineering.
The rapacious system of engineered false desires and mindless mass consumption is the natural outcome of a world in love with money. A world deluded by the lure and magic of fleeting monetary wealth. Nowadays, as the rulers of the earth have managed to consume all political institutions in which men once worked out their differences through free speech rights and largely uncorrupted logic and law, we are now under the sway of the owners of the means of capital production. Who knew the life we'd been given as a gift of God we'd use to pursue a grand illusion?
We all need to support the global goals.
If the prince of the power of the air rules the airwaves that carry the signals that penetrate every social, psychological, biological, and economic structure in the world, it seems reasonable that media would have the effect of deluding so many. It seems entirely reasonable, too, that media would appear in so many of the devices that permeate the social world today. If the events of 9/11 were a test of the mainstream media's ability to wipe out dissenting views of the official mythology propagated by the powers that be, and if the COVID-19 operation was yet another test of state power to breach the sovereign rights of the people to reject illegal medical experiments, can the LGBTQIA+ global movement also be read as another test? Is it a litmus test designed to determine who will and will not obey the social engineers of a new technocratic utopia, devoid of natural human rights to natural forms of human reproduction, denying the rights of women, for example, to assert power of their own identities as females? Rainbows galore. Regarding the first sign of unfolding trouble, the Lamb that was slain to redeem the world loosened the first seal of the scroll and triggered the appointed time of tribulation for earth and its inhabitants. How can we make some sense of this present period? Step away from the virtue signaling and societal madness, stirring our emotions, and know if the tribulation is upon us, and see more clearly whether we are now actors on some cosmic stage, playing the parts we had auditioned for. It is written, the Lord knew us before we were born, cast our souls in flesh, and we chose to assume the roles we are now playing. In Revelation 6:1, we find that the rider of a white horse had a bow, that a crown was given to him, and that he went out conquering and to conquer. Here we encounter another complex symbol of the apocalypse, a rider saddled for battle, aiming to conquer something. But what sort of knight, we might ask, would ride into battle without sword or shield? Would such a warrior expect to conquer without proper weaponry? Is the bow a delivery vehicle for unmentioned arrows? Answering these questions requires some wider context. For that, we turn briefly to the Old Testament. Recall, during the Babylonian captivity, the prophet Jeremiah, describing a time in the future when the Lord of hosts will bring Judah and Israel back into the land promised to Abraham. We read, quote, "Alas for that great day, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it," unquote. Concerning the end of the age, Jesus confirms in Matthew 24 Jeremiah's ancient description of that unique day in human history, a time of suffering like none other, a time of, quote, "great distress unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again," unquote. Since the accuser of the brethren, Satan, has no power to create material substance, he can only attempt, by deception, to approximate the powers of the Lord. In the same way, where the Lord declares his unchanging covenants, Satan also plots through deception to concoct his own. But these, as we shall see, can only be broken because Satan has no power or sway over history. It is Jesus, rather, who is the beginning and the end, the Aleph and Tav. Concerning the future, Jeremiah's most significant prophecy is the one regarding the new covenant. Jeremiah foretold a time when the Lord of hosts would make a covenant with Israel, superseding the old Mosaic covenant. Adonai would write his law upon the hearts of men, rather than on tablets of stone, and all would come to know God directly and receive his forgiveness. If Satan masquerades as an angel of light, we can see in recent years how his fleeting promises take root in the hearts of men. Guided by their false hopes for, quote, "sustainable markets," unquote, and a peaceful future on a planet prepared for wrath. Could evidence of what triggers the rider of the white horse, of the coming tribulation, be found in the blasphemies uttered by powerful men? In November 2021, a prince enters into a covenant with his subjects, Earth's inhabitants, with a promise of sustaining the world through the new sustainable goals of development. In November 2022, an interfaith gathering on Mount Sinai to demonstrate their, quote, climate repentance, unquote, to Mother Earth, calls for the act of, quote, smashing mock tablets, unquote, more inversions of truth, and mockery of Moses and his disgust in seeing the Israelites bowing down to a golden image of Baal. In September of 2023, delegates from all nations convened in New York City for the 2023 SDG Summit to confirm, they claim, the dire need to fulfill the 2030 Agenda. It has been sufficiently clear since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 that all the world's nations are now moving in unison to a common goal, a one world government, formed by incremental moves towards so-called climate action, the unifying force that undermines national sovereignty and makes humanity itself the target of elimination. Its level of delusion and self-loathing unfolding on a global scale begs the question, what sort of force is behind the machinations moving the world closer to self-destruction? Returning to the rider of the white horse, we find him wearing a crown. If a crown had been given to him, are we to infer that the rider had already achieved some sort of victory? Is the rider that cryptic force described by the prophet Daniel? Quote, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation, until the end that is decreed is poured out upon him. Unquote. Will this covenant, calling for peace, precipitate the rebuilding of the third temple? Surely the unblemished red heifer, which has not appeared in Israel for 2,000 years, and which is now prepared for a ritual sacrifice, must mean something to the confirmation of this covenant. If it is so, a better image of the rider seems to come into focus. In Revelation 6, Stephanos describes the victor's crown, a symbol of victory in the public games, or a poetic contest. Does the man of lawlessness have a clever way with words? The Greek word Stephanos has an additional meaning and doesn't always refer to a crown of gold. The denotation for Stephanos also includes reference to a victory wreath given to athletes who win a contest. A wreath of olive leaves and sprigs, also called ekotinos. Unsurprisingly, with the great influence of Greek culture on Rome, later Roman crowns appeared with the same laurel design. If the Greek word for crown, as used in Revelation, is Stephanos, this sort of linguistic contact across cultures can help us see how Rome had adopted both Greek and Latin, the latter use applied especially for military purposes. Perhaps even more interesting is that the Latin equivalent to Stephanos is corona. Given the many denotations connected to this kind of crown, we may be tempted to imagine possible associations more meaningful to us today, such as the coronavirus that conquered the governments of most nations, the world figures who, by their clever words, won the hearts and minds of many, coaxing them to line up and accept the sorcery pushed on people, wanting to return to a life of peace and security. And we might imagine, too, the nations united under one banner, crowned by a wreath of olive branches, now taking greater control over world affairs. It is at least a curious fact that Klaus Schwab's famous 282-page book, which many scholars view as a template for instituting a new technocratic global order, was published just 4 months after the story of a coronavirus pandemic was announced. The writer also carried a bow, toxon. The first denotation refers to an arc, but other denotations refer to the simplest fabric. Could this simple fabric be a banner or a flag, the symbol of some political or economic center of power? Interestingly, contemporary associations of toxon refer to a collection of liberal parties in Greece. We might also think of fabric in metaphorical terms, such as the underlying structure or framework of something, that is, the fabric of the universe or the fabric of society, which, in the present age, has been disrupted and badly torn by new anti-human policies and social practices. The Hebrew equivalent in the Old Testament, keshet, refers directly to rainbow, the sign of God's promise not to destroy the earth again by water. The meaning of the symbols of the rider, the crown, and the bow would hardly be comprehensible to scholars before the year 2012, when the, quote, Sustainable Development Goals, unquote, began emerging in Rio de Janeiro, imposing its will upon all nations. If the man of lawlessness successfully, quote, confirms a covenant with many, unquote, and that covenant is an agreed upon peace among nations, or peace with the earth, then this covenant made among men sets the rider of Revelation 6 free to trigger a series of ensuing calamities, the subject of which we will explore in the following episodes. May the Prince of Peace give us the eyes to see his designs for the world will come to pass, and give us the peace and joy we need to labor in the face of tribulations. Adonai be glorified.